Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us. A few weeks ago, somebody said to us, I'm not a conservative, but I am a traditionalist. And that got us to thinking, what's the difference between a conservative and a traditionalist? Why some people might feel more comfortable with one label over the other, and whether it might actually be time to ditch the old labels.
I don't think the old labels are working for us. I think, we've covered in a previous podcast the concept of divide and conquer. I think these labels are effectively dividing us and preventing us from seeking common cause.
Yes, I agree. I think that when we are focused on the labels, then we are focusing on the differences, or it actually limits us in the choices we make. I saw a tweet from someone recently and they said, traditionally I'd be Democrat, but I'm going to be voting with my eyes closed this time. So I'm going to vote for closed borders and lower taxes and more affordable energy prices. And those are the issues that are the most important to me today, and those are the issues that I'm going to focus on. And I'm not going to look at the label of who will help to provide those things that I need.
And that's the key thing there, is that they're going beyond tribalism, because the traditional way is, if you're of the left, you would say, I'm never going to vote for the right because they're selfish and heartless. And if you're of the right, you'll say, I'm never going to vote for the left because they're profligate and they're bad managers. And a lot of it, I've come to the conclusion, in my considered opinion, that you have to break down these categories. The old left and right is no longer working for us.
I do think that in all situations, we're never going to find a perfect candidate to vote for. We're always going to need to choose the least worst option.
Yes.
And so you vote for the policies that are most important to you.
Correct.
And your family and your community.
Yep.
But I do also think that by focusing on the labels, we get the worst of both worlds rather than the best.
I think you're right.
And the way forward would be to take the good from each and bring them together.
One of the key things, I think, is to recognise how that mechanic works. How do you actually get the worst of both worlds? And one aspect of that mechanic is simply that if you are voting along tribal lines, you will be taken advantage of by those who consider you a safe vote. So if someone, it doesn't matter which party it is, but if they consider you their core constituency and you're never going to be a swing voter, they'll take you for granted. They won't deliver what you want. And therefore, the only real solution is to not be a party voter at all. You don't want to vote along tribal lines.
This is going to take some deprogramming in how we think about things and how we think about the political sphere, because I know I'm guilty of this, in that I label people, it makes my life easier.
I do it all the time, and I'm trying to get out of the habit.
If we can slowly work towards this, if we can do 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then we will slowly wean ourselves out of this tribalist thinking that has been decades in the making.
Well, it's interesting delving into the history of where the phrases left and right come from. Originally, it comes from the French Revolutionary Parliament of 1789, where the radicals, what we now would now call the leftists or the socialists, sat on the left side of Parliament, and those that were in favour of the Ancien Regime sat on the right side of Parliament. And this is where a lot of it comes from. So on the right side of Parliament was not only the king and the aristocrats, it was the church as well, because they were considered the second estate, and a lot of the merchants and traders, because back then they ran a mercantilist system where basically those who were making money off trading were doing it because they had a writ from the absolute monarch. So, and that is one of the key things about the French monarchy at the time, is it was an absolute monarchy. It was never a constitutional monarchy like we're used to thinking of in the Anglosphere. So it's actually a foreign concept, the left versus right. And it's a concept from a long time ago. And one of my favourite sayings these days is, this isn't France and it's not 1789. So we need to ditch the left and the right, because they don't really match what we see. When people walk and talk on the street or at parties, you're not talking about the right being the party of the aristocrats. You're talking about the right being the party of free market capitalism. When you're talking of the left, you're not really talking about the radicals of French socialism. We have a hugely deep and rich heritage in the Anglosphere of working class people banding together, first into the unions and then into political apparatuses like the Labour Party. And they were arguing for things that no one would argue against. They were arguing for the 8-hour day. They were arguing for, safety in the workplace so that people will actually come home and things like that. So both of these traditions that we talk about have good fundamental bones. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been successful in the first place. But we have what's called an equivocation, where the academics will talk about left and right as in how it originally started with the French Revolutionary Parliament, and then we have the day-to-day definition of left and right, which is more to do with the parties that we see in play today.
This is a very interesting point, because it recognises that those good things that these ideas and tribes, what we now have as tribes across the political divide, it recognises the good things that each side has, and also helps us to understand where they come from.
So from my perspective, I like to think of the traditional left as epitomised by the quote, "No man is an island unto himself." To me, that's a truism. We do live in society. We can't live a sort of radical individualist lifestyle. We do actually need each other. Humans are social beings.
The left have this idea of putting human first. And when you're talking about things like the safer workplace, certain living standards, the 8-hour workday, no child labour, those are all things that we can get behind and that we all agree with. The right traditionally was about enterprise, going and building a new business or exploring. Those sorts of things are traditionally from the right wing. And when we take those sorts of things, once again, this is the good stuff, nobody's going to argue that those are important, because at the end of the day, our country and our economy and our history is built on enterprising small businesses.
And this is where when we look around at our politicians and the policies in our various countries, what we actually see is that working conditions are being eroded. But at the other end of the scale, we're getting more regulation. So we're getting the worst. We're not getting the protections, but we are getting the regulations and rules. And then from the right's perspective, you're not getting the free enterprise because all the regulations are stopping the enterprise, and you don't protect the institutions. The institutions are gone. So you don't get any protection of that which you want to be protected. So you're getting the worst of both worlds. This leads me into Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which he wrote 1944. And in Hayek's Road to Serfdom, he talks about one of the mechanisms by which we all end up in a place where none of us wanted to go. And it comes down to a fundamental problem with democracy, and that is that it leads to inertia because we're always infighting, and the left versus right is infighting. It's a divide and conquer tactic, like we've talked about before, and we're so busy arguing against each other that nothing gets done. That inertia then leads to frustration, both from the people and from the people in the bureaucracy. And that frustration then leads to the usurpation of the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy take things into their own hand and they just do it. And that has been spoken out loud by Keir Starmer in the UK, where he says that he prefers Davos over Westminster because at Davos he can get things done.
That's also epitomised with the discussion that's had recently about the blob stopping Brexit from happening.
Yes, the bureaucracy is the blob, the bureaucracy is the swamp.
So we need to shed the baggage of the old tribes. And how are we going to do that? What's the way forward?
The way forward is there's two models that we see out there already which are making some progress. One is what we see in the US. Don't get distracted by the polarizing politics of Trump for a few seconds. What he's actually trying to do is change one of the parties from the inside. And in many respects, this harks back way before Trump to the Tea Party movement, where they saw the Republican establishment as not really representing them. And that's where we get the phrase rhino, Republican in name only. So that's really one model, is take over one of the parties from the inside. There are issues with that, but we'll get to that as well. The other model is what we see in the UK, where the classic example there is the Reform Party. They did very well, at least in terms of number of votes, but they aren't the Tories. They're not Labour, but they're up to 18% in the polls. They are already the third party in terms of vote share, and they could become the party if they can draw both from the Tories and from Labour.
They've actually got a precedent for that in the UK already. Prior to reform, the Lib Dems provided an alternative vote for people who didn't want to vote Tory and didn't want to vote Labour. And they got quite a lot of the votes as well when people didn't want to. So now in the UK they've got almost two options again to vote that's neither of the traditional main parties.
Yes. Interestingly enough, the Lib Dems, one of the key successes they had was focusing on local politics and building up a local centre of base, not focusing on the national scene, but focusing on the local scene first. You get your following, you get your base established that way. It's easier to break into a local elections than it is to break in on the national scene. There are issues that I see with the US model insofar as people do end up having to hold their nose to vote. So if you're a Democrat in the US and you want to see the Uni Party destroyed and you want to see a new paradigm emerge, you have to have the courage to take that leap of faith, to move over to the Republicans, to hold your nose and vote the way that you haven't done in the past. Where the UK system has an advantage is that no one has to hold their nose. We can just simply come as equals and say, Red Tribe has something to give. Blue Tribe has something to give. Let's take the best of both worlds. The downside of the UK model is that it's more difficult to come as a third party and come into a position of influence and power, whereas if you're taking over another party from the inside, that's a much easier prospect in some ways, because all of the infrastructure's there, there's the brand recognition, and you can do it. But you're going to carry over some baggage, and that's really what we want to avoid, is carrying over baggage.
Yes.
Because we want all of us, in which case we need to recognise that both sides have something to offer.
Now, both of those solutions are also a little bit of a step away, that we cast a vote and then expect somebody else to do something. What can we do ourselves in the day to day to help us as a society and a culture to get past this left-right divide.
Yeah, great point. We need to embrace the new paradigm. It is no longer left versus right. It's the establishment or the wethers against the people, the demos. And what's key now is that we shed that baggage of the old tribes and we start having an honest conversation amongst the people, amongst the demos, as to what we want to keep, the good things that we want to keep, and the bad things that we want to discard as unneeded baggage.
And also, we need to avoid thin slicing people and putting labels on them.
Yes, this is one of my big things, is I don't want to use the words left and right, but I want to try to train myself out of that. And that's something that I can do personally.
And then we can start to look at what it is that we want to keep and the things that are no longer working.
Focusing on what unites us instead of what divides us. Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.